All right, so this is, excuse me, Notes toward a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. Part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December Declaration toward the Destruction of Democracy. And I've been adding in America, even though it's not there in David Antin's, original title, which for him is, part 11, and for us is part 12. But in any case, whether we add the in America or not, and leave it, more strictly alliterative in as it exists in David's presentation. This is the section that we have been in for quite some time, part 12, David's part 11, and in this segment of our part 12, David's part 11, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December Declaration toward the Destruction of Democracy, you will recall that David is going to discuss, well, we are going to discuss David's discussion in his 11th, section, the scene two of Act 1 of Aristophanes, the smile of the Sphinx. So to begin with, David describes and discusses the stage set and the design, and how it relates to the progress of the way that this story, this narrative, is depicted for the stage in Aristophanes. And I'm not entirely sure, whether David is actually, describing accurately the design as it was, presented for the Greek stage, the Greek comedic stage, under the authority of Thalia, the muse Thalia of Greek comedy, or whether he's, actually misremembering the design of the Greek stage and recalling a contemporary performance of Aristophanes' smile of the Sphinx that he might have seen presented on the stage, perhaps at UCSD, perhaps directed by František Deák, or perhaps elsewhere, perhaps a performance arranged for the Museum of Contemporary Art in La Jolla, when it was still the Museum of Contemporary Art in La Jolla, and when it was still interesting. And I don't know who would have, I don't know who would have organized and produced and directed it there, but it's certainly possible, that he saw it there, or that he saw it elsewhere, and so I'm not entirely certain whether this description, belongs to a memory that David has of seeing a piece, this particular play, The Smile of the Sphinx, as it was produced and directed, sometime in the late 20th, or perhaps in the first 3 years of the 21st century, so contemporaneous, or roughly contemporaneous with the telling, and as opposed to his memory of the comedic design as is described in some classical text. But in any case, this is how David describes this particular scene, in which is scene 2 in Act 1 of Aristophanes' The Smile of the Sphinx. So the stage, David says, is divided in half, and on the on the left half, you see Laius, and he's sitting on his throne, and you recognize, Laius, by the crown, David says. And if you were going to do the syllogistic logic, you would say, all Greek kings, whether they're tyrants or not, wear crowns. Whether or not Laius, and then that'd be A, and then B, David says, could be whether or not you regard Laius, and or Donald Trump as a tyrant. Laius wears a crown, and therefore Laius is Laius, and he doesn't put it that way. I don't know precisely why, but he makes reference to, in one of those elements of the syllogism, he makes reference to the number, right, involved in the three elements of the syllogism, and I can't say why David does it. I know in a certain sense why Aristotle is fascinated with the number 3, and it has to do in curious ways, both with the number 3 that we associate with the triple goddess, and with Hecate, and with that with the form of the triple goddess as. So David Antin doesn't say this, but I'll go ahead and say it and make it explicit. Let's see, we seem to be stuck here. Let me click on this and see if I can get David Antin to say it. Okay, so as I said, David Antin doesn't explicitly state this in his presentation, but I'll go ahead and say it, and he may be hinting at it when he adds in this third part of the syllogism in C, a reference to the number 3, and why, right? Aristotle is perhaps so fascinated with 3, and this belongs to the relationship between Hecate in her triple form as the triple goddess, and the 3 aspects of the divine feminine, and Hecate's specific relation to the crossroads as the guardian or keeper of the symbolic value of the crossroads, or as we might call it, the fork in the road, the tripleus amoxitois. So the branches in the direction that one is allowed in the fork in the road refer to the mysteries of the divine feminine, particularly as they relate to this figure Hecate, but also as they relate to other figurations of the triple goddess in Greek culture. And as I said, David Antin doesn't make this explicit, though I think he hints at it in what he does with the third part of this syllogism, and the way that he becomes self-referential in relationship to the way that syllogisms are taken up in Aristotle. But then of course this figuration of the 3 the women is also there in the representation of the Moira, right, in the 3 fates, and interestingly Hecate is also described as a spinner, or weaver, and the metaphor that in Greek culture is used to describe like the fates and the doom and the fatality of the inscription of human lives in this cosmic and ineluctable, one could say, design is precisely that of the weaver. So that one of the 3 fates represents the spinner, and one represents the measurer, and one represents the cutter. And so in describing this third element of the syllogism, which I misrepresented, initially, when I described, David Antin's description of it, but he says something like, and I can't quite remember exactly, but he says something like, and in the third part of the syllogism, C, or if we prefer to call it, 3, because it is the third part of the syllogism, we would recognize that, something like, this guy wearing a hat must be, because we've arrived at the third part of the syllogism here in the symbolic tripleus amoxitois, a king. And I'm still saying it, I'm still saying it wrong and not quite getting it, the way that that David Antin so elegantly formulates it, but what he formulates when he gets to this third element of the syllogism, the therefore, is a reference to the way that this third part of the syllogism and its conclusion is a form, right? Is a form or a figuration of this place, the tripleus amoxitois, that we associate, with the feminine divine, and both with Hecate, whose Latin form, right, who the Romans referred to as trivia, right, which is the word in Latin for the three-part fork in the road, the crossroads. And and it's our word. And again, David doesn't get into all of this, but he might have, or maybe maybe his unconscious was pushing this to the surface, and because he wanted to make this association between the syllogismos, the syllogistic logic, right, that is so much a part of the Sophocles, and is. And that so much informs, Aristotle's reading, and the way that, in a certain sense, it's the logical and, scientific, usurpation of a much older, tradition that belongs to this associative quality that that the number 3 carries, both in relationship to the tripleus, not both, but in all of its relationships to the, tripleus amoxitois, to the triple goddess as characterized by Hecate, and to the form, right, of the weavers and measurers and cutters of fate, the Moira, right? So all of that, perhaps existing there in the third line, in which he says, and therefore, because it is the third part of the syllogism, and also, symbolically, the that place in the road, the tripleus amoxitois, in which not only logical, decisions, but the decisions which bear upon the course and outcomes of events as they unfold in the rhetorical realities, constructed by our narratives, as well as in the depths of the psyche in which, narrative, in my sense of the terms, are formed, or something like that, which is like, hypotactically embedded in this part of his sentence, that follows the therefore, because we see that Laius is wearing, a crown, we know that he is the king, and therefore Laius, and then he goes, back to, what he had begun, which is the description of this. Of this scene as it exists in the first act, and how it's constructed for the stage. And we've already determined that on the right side of the stage, Laius is sitting in his crown, and there's a stationary backdrop. David describes this stationary backdrop, which is painted onto the screen of the back wall of this side of the stage, which you recall is bifurcated in two. And on this side, the background is simply the scene of the palace, and all of the furniture and belongings that also help identify. There's no sign that says the guy sitting on the throne is Laius, but David's described why we know that it is, and why in the context of this particular performance we don't have to be told who this character is. And then he moves on to the bifurcated left side of the stage, and he identifies the figure of Tiresias, and he says, and we know who they are because we've already seen them in these three series of dreams, and the deduction that we're asked to perform here is no deduction whatsoever, he says, but merely a matter of memory, and we recognize Tiresias because they haven't changed over the course of time in which this scene is set. In fact, it's the next day. David says it's the night after the three dreams of Tiresias, and we now see them there embarking. Clearly, David says, embarking on this venture and course, right, to the palace of Thebes to inform Laius of and convey the message of this dream, and inform him that at all costs he must destroy this. Well, David says, well, let's not jump the gun. David says, let's not jump the gun here. Let's focus on what we're seeing before our eyes as this second scene in the first act unfolds. And he says, and what we see is that Tiresias is either on some type of conveyor belt and walking against the movement of the conveyor belt, so that you can see that Tiresias, and he either uses he or she, but we can say that they are walking toward the palace. And the way that this unfolds in this scene is that there's a backdrop, and the backdrop is moving. So there's a painted backdrop, he says, and the painted backdrop is moving, but Tiresias, his legs are moving, but he's not going anywhere. But on this backdrop, there's some kind of a conveyor belt, and it has a platform in front of it. And so you can put three-dimensional objects or humans or actors on this platform, and they can pass. And Tiresias can pass, and David says, he either uses he or she, but he says they can pass these figures along the road as they're moving toward what represents the palace. So the function, of this unfolding backdrop, David says, is twofold, and relates, right, to the complexities in which narrative is revealed, right, in terms of symbols and signs and all of these dimensions that belong to the Greek culture and the audience's understanding, right, of the meaning and significance of all of these elements, but also in a certain respect to the unfolding of the unconscious and the idea of revelation as that element relates not only to the dream that Tiresias has already had, but to predictions and possible outcomes of the narrative, and particularly in the way that the narrative, the narratological strategies are revealing themselves to us and to their unfolding as we proceed through this symbolic landscape, but also function, as David Antin says, like that same kind of discursive domain, right, that Kathy Acker's encounter with Herbert Marcuse as a kind of Laius figure represents. And even though that one can say that that's an example of an untruth, but that particular rhetorical deception that she makes in describing Herbert Marcuse as her teacher, right, like opens us to this discursive domain in which we can understand it as a kind of narratological representation of her own identification, right, as an artist, presiding under the discipline of Parabasisia, that is the muse of transgression, and this counter, on the road to whatever, Thebes, that this muse of transgression directs her toward, right, must necessarily involve the confrontation with and struggle, one could say, or argument, or conflict, engaging in a form of rhetorical conflict with this conceptual idea of that belongs to the discourse of, David says, of Herbert Marcuse, which is repressive desublimation. And Kathy Acker understands that if she wishes to be an artist, an aesthetician, or a semiotician of the transgressive, sooner or later, she's going to have to encounter this figure of repressive desublimation on her road to whatever Thebes, it is that she's traversing toward. And in the same way, the figures and the way they present themselves to Tiresias, as Tiresias makes their way, David says, his or her way, to Laius and to the palace, that and David says he or she, that she, again, and we'll say they're walking toward, that these figures also in addition to representing the course that Tiresias takes on their journey, right, to effectively do what presumably the function of these dreams presented them with, to mediate the conflict between this tyrannical father and this homolokos. How do you David? I don't think David utilizes here the noun homolokos as an adjectival form, but I've the sentence that I've set myself up for is calling for whatever adjectival form bomolokos, would take, the bomolokosaic, I don't know. But anyway, this bomolokosaic, figure of Oedipus, confronting the tyrant, and the results of that encounter, which David points out, can't be good either way, right? Either the son kills the father or the father kills the son. And we know in either case, the result, the consequence of all of this is the plague, the plague that in this case ravages Thebes, but in that period between 2020 and 2024 is ravaging our future United States, right? And so this is the task of the dream, and this is the task that Tiresias takes, and sets out upon, and of course, the first here we see the first figure, that Tiresias sets before himself, and then we'll correct David and say themselves, is Laius, and he wishes to convey to this tyrant king, a warning that if he in fact takes this journey and confronts this figure, Oedipus, at the fork in the road, at the crossroads, right, that symbolically belongs to both in a certain sense Hecate and to the Moira, the Tripleus amoxitois, that the syllogistic the syllogistic consequences, if one wanted to be an Aristotelian, David says, of this encounter, will be the destruction by plague of the demos of Thebes, right? The citizenry of Thebes, the populace, the people of Thebes, and because Tiresias understands the dream, and because he wants this to prevent this outcome, he takes this path, but upon taking this path, both the audience and perhaps Tiresias as well in a certain respect, but certainly not here, David says, because you can't see these figures. But the dream reveals, to Tiresias, some of the deeper mysteries that belong to this configuration of threes, and the meaning of the Tripleus amoxitois, and the meaning, of her, David Antin says, but we can say, their own, hermaphroditism, and their sacred, nature, in relationship to, the transgression of these, what we would call today, David says, structural or binary, paradigms of gender and sexuality, and to aspects of the sacred feminine, and David says so that there's a rhetorical dimension that that plays itself out as in the way that these figures that are on the platform of the stage pass by as Tiresias approaches the palace, right? And so David wants to examine, these figures, both as they represent, simply events in space and time, right? So the background is unfolding, and what do we expect? Simply, I'll finish that sentence and then I'll go on. Simply, events in space and time, and their symbolic values as they relate to all of these issues concerning the number three, and how it relates to the divine, feminine, and prophecy, and the sacred, and all of these symbols, that we saw in Tiresias' dream, and how, in a certain way that it's appropriated, by the I don't know if we really want to call but it's appropriated in a certain way by the form it takes, the quasi patriarchal form that it takes in the logic of science and sort of the causality of the syllogismos, right? The syllogistic logic that transforms, right, the mysteries of the number three into a kind of logos that, if not explicitly patriarchal, is placed in the hands of men, right, who now understand through this form that once belonged to the mysteries, particularly the mysteries as they were represented in the divine feminine, and so one could say that the revelation of this appropriation, right, is part of the discursive domain, that Aristophanes is playing with and hinting at and articulating, right, through the way that these figures are represented as Tiresias passes them beyond, right? Just where and what they represent in space-time as an unfolding of events. And he says that, and as an unfolding of events, these figures represent the following. He says, well, the first figure that he passes by is Diarmenia, his wife Diarmenia, the Greek word for interpreter, right? And in a certain sense, and then he goes back to Aristotle, and he says, in a certain sense, right, in deductive logic, deduction replaces interpretation, and there's something David says, like, there's something of the idea in the word messenger, and what it hints at, in hermeneutics, the Hermes in hermeneutics, right, already hints at what we understand, belongs to this word hermaphrodite, and the sacred hermaphrodite that Tiresias represents is that the other half of the word hermaphrodite that doesn't derive from the word Hermes, the messenger, is Aphrodite, right, the goddess of beauty, and David makes reference to the etymology of the name Aphrodite, and talks about Aphros and how she emerges from the foam, and constructs an argument, right, that in the figure of the divine hermaphrodite, especially as represented in this character of Tiresias, that there's a play, right, with all of these elements that involve messages as they exist in the sacred dream form, right, but also the way they get played out and particularly the way they get played out in relationship to other forms of messaging and messaging, right, that doesn't involve the sacred or divine, as in and he briefly mentions the roles that Dramatikos, eironicus, and Dramatikos and anagnoreikos will play as messengers in this piece, and then in the complex ways that characters like Tiresias' wife are constructed as semi or quasi allegorical figurations of ideas such as interpretation and so he says all of this, and then he says he returns to the idea of the distinction between what the unfolding of this set, right, and this rolling set represents in relationship to Tiresias's location in space and time, because he's moving toward the capital and it has to tell us this, and that's purely informational in a certain sense. But then he says, but there's this discourse behind it, and so the first figure that we see as Tiresias sets out on the road to the palace, or the journey to the palace, the first figure that we see, and it makes sense, right, in terms of the unfolding of these events strictly as events, is Diarmenia, and David says he here, but we can say they, and as they pass, we recognize that it's Diarmenia because, well, we only have to rely on our memory, and because we've already seen Diarmenia in this first scene within the three dreams, and here, she's no longer in the audience with us. She's on this unfolding and rolling, backdrop into the stage that tells us that we're on the road to Thebes. But she also represents the idea of interpretation, itself. And we know it's her, he says, because we remember what she looks like, but we also are pointed toward, a deeper understanding of what her figure and her character means in relationship to these deeper mysteries that Aristophanes is hinting at as all of this as all of this, event content, right, rolls itself out, before our eyes. So, she's looking at him, David says, and we can correct him, obviously, and say she's looking at them, but of course they don't see her, and they, in this scene, which is not a dream scene, they're carrying their walking stick and walking toward the palace, and this gets a laugh out of the audience, David says, because we've already established that Diarmenia is a comic figure, and all she really has to do is glance, and the fact that she can see Tiresias, and that but David says she can't see her, causes us to laugh, and the humor is carried, in the discrepancy and through the weight of what we already know about the comic potentiality of Diarmenia in relationship to the actions and activities of her, and of course in that case he's referring to Diarmenia, and the her is completely correct, her husband, and then whether Tiresias is a husband or not is somewhat problematic, but let's align over that, and just allow David the reference husband carries the weight of a lot of this comedy. So she glances at her, and then at her spouse, let's say, and then we get the laugh. And then and this belongs to that element David argues of the discursive domain, right, that relates the figure of Diarmenia to interpretation, and one can be an interpreter of dreams in this Tiresian way, right, or an interpreter of signs on the road in this detective kind of way, or an interpreter of dreams in a kind of Freudian way, or an interpreter of slips of the tongue in a kind of Freudian way, or of a detective, David says, and perhaps perhaps one wants to find out why one's telling a story about Mary, or why one's about someone who's named Mary, or one wants to find out why one is telling a story again, concerning, the outcomes of the fate of Oedipus, even though, it had already been told, right, in the form of a tragedy by Sophocles. Why would Aristophanes tell it again? So one could be a detective about that. And one could be, I suppose, David says, in a Freudian interpreter of that as well. And perhaps there was something in Aristophanes. Like, he says, there are these, Freudian, art critics that are going to look at Aristophanes' play, and they're going to say, well, what is it about Aristophanes that he needs to tell this particular story and re-engage, his own, narrative identification with this figure of Oedipus as it's defined by Freud, right? And maybe Aristophanes, had some difficulty or struggle, right? Passing through these stages of psychosexual development. Maybe he got, hung up in the oral stage and needed these characters to work out the dimensions of that particular, psychological impasse as the conflict of the oral stage, as this setting where fate, is where the outcomes of fate, are made, and or challenged in the place at the fork in the road, the Troipleus Amaxitois, and he says, and there are critics, that perform this, and they perform it endlessly, he says, and it doesn't matter what's going on. Like he says, it doesn't matter that for these critics that need to play these roles out endlessly, like stock characters in a Greek tragedy, that they'll tell you the same thing again and again and again about these artists, right, and their motivations, and the motivations will be, informed by whether they successfully passed, through this through this place in the road that Freud describes as the oral stage, or whether they were defeated there, right, by Laius or some sphinx, and it won't matter, if a tyrant like Donald Trump, right, is is taking us down this fascist road and destroying democracy in America. They'll still be arguing that whatever artist that they're or whatever artist, whatever painter or whatever poet, right, or whatever whatever Greek playwright or whatever avant-gardist or whatever maker of object that they're talking about, right, is engaged, with this struggle on the road as it represents this conflict, with father as father is defined by Freud, or with the outcome of one of the successful passages through these stages, right? And what are the stages for Freud? David says, and he says, I haven't mentioned this before when I talked about narrative and Freud, but he says, but if you really want to deal with the way that Freud picks up, dream as narrative, and particularly relate it to my notion of the distinction between narrative as this subject, confronting the possibility or inevitability of change, or resistance to such change, versus story as a series of events unfolding. He says, if you really want to take that notion of my distinction seriously, right, and apply it to the interpretation of dreams as an idea of narrative, then you have to begin with the three stages of psychosexual development, right? You can't begin with the interpretation of dreams, because you have to understand that, like, even to get to the interpretation of dreams and to diarmenia as a symbolic figure in Freud's construction of the notion of dream as story, but not story, but narrative in my sense of the terms, right? A theory of narrative in the way that I distinguish narrative from story. Then you have to understand that each of these encounters, right, or the passage, right, the passage through the oral stage. So the oral stage is first, right? The child has a relationship to the mother. It's somewhat symbiotic. It's dependent. It's dependent upon what? It's dependent upon food, and it cries out, right? The child cries out when the child is hungry, and this stage, belongs to this initial stage that Freud describes as the oral stage, and this is the first stage, and so the trochleus amoxitosis in the oral stage, it has to be passed through, and there has to be like a certain amount of independence, and this crying out for food and sustenance and to be sustained, right, by the comfort of the breast. There has to be a resolution in which a kind of independence, and so the child learns to walk and move her or his fingers, and we can add their fingers, and then and acquire these things, and then if that's successful, and you choose the proper path at this fork in the road, as opposed to the one that leads towards failure, right, and dependence, then you move on along this course to the next fork in the road. And what fork in the road is that? He says, and for Freud, this is the anal stage. This is right where the child has to learn to control, right, like control the functions of the body, and to poop in appropriate places and in appropriate times and when, and he says, and of course all of this has a bearing, and he laughs, a bearing upon the affect of the child as well, so right, like the self-understanding, as discipline, control and regulation of this particular body function, relates to the disposition of the child, according to Freud as well. And then, and then he talks about, taking that path and overcoming that obstacle, and then moving on, to the phallic stage, right? So, okay, so we're not going to get into, too much of all of that, but he says, so David says, so talking, so lengthily, about, that kind of interpretation, seems like a digression here, because, we're really, we digressed in talking about, the particular dimensions in which interpretation, as represented by the figure of diarmenia, becomes a discursive domain in Aristophanes, not the way that it becomes, a discursive domain in the contemporary, art criticism world and literary criticism world. But he says, but it's not really, that much of a digression, because he says, because the way that this context, right, this context for interpretation in a certain sense, in these critics, worldview and modus operandi, right, can allow itself, to disregard, the events in actual, our social political, transformations that are ongoing, right, in our experience of the world, like becomes this kind of like, he says, becomes a kind of like ahistoricist and academic broadcloth, in which in which the relevance of the work, right, of interpreter, is no longer performative and reflective of an unfolding of social reality, but becomes like a static backdrop for a performance that's and he uses and he compares it to, at this moment he compares it to the unfolding of Gertrude Stein's continuous present, but not in a positive way, not in not in this positive self-reflective way, but as he says, like, imagine that Gertrude Stein's unfolding of continuous present, what wasn't about like the contingencies and engagement with the now, but we're rather like an endless repetition of variations, in a backdrop, that could allow itself, to become, right, the veil and the veil and blindness, right, in a certain way to the unfolding events. And so that imagine that no matter who was rising to power, that and this happened for some academics. David points out in history, and there were some academics in history in the early and mid 20th century when these various tyrants rose to power, and Hitler was one of them. And in order to continue their work and continue the backdrop of this kind of like endless recycling of mode, right, of interpretation, that you do ignore the emergence of the tyrant, or ignore the various responsibilities, right, of the dream that was provided for Tiresias, and merely interpret the dream of Tiresias as and he says, and it's really, in a certain sense, it's unfair to Freud, because it's not like Freud necessarily like provided a model and paradigm for the failure, right, to respond to the contingencies of our social political climate, but for some critics, he did. And just like for some critics, even Marx could provide he says it's paradoxical, but even Marx could provide a paradigm whose relevance became so overwhelmingly important as backdrop for the presentation of a diarmeniosis. I don't know if that's really a word, but David coins it here, an interpretational or interpretoriosis that they became completely incapable of responding to the unfolding of social political events in the world, the need to challenge voting restrictions, the need, to challenge the rise and growth of fascism in this period, between 2016 and 2024. The need, to support and provide for all of our fellow human beings in locations and countries and states, perhaps who hadn't developed adequate medical response to combat the COVID viruses, as well as to combat those tyrannical states and countries that utilized once again the conditions of and threat, right, of the plague as an excuse to control populations and to manipulate and oppress individuals, and he makes reference to China, and then also to the resistance to that, which we don't really have time for here, but then David will return to this moment in the unfolding, right, of scene 2 in Act 1 of The Smile of the Sphinx, and in his interpretation, his reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the way this journey that Tiresias takes to the palace and to Laius in order to convey this message that he needs to take action, right, in order to ensure the safety of the future of Thebes, the way that it's unfolding, as an unfolding as well of these, one could say, meta-discursive, domains that relate to the understanding of these symbolic characteristics of archaic Greek culture. Especially as they're represented in terms of the relationships, between he says hermeneutics, where here we might as well refer to it as hermaphrodites, right? Not just hermeneutics, but hermaphrodites, and the way that they relate to these ideas of interpretation and deduction and the unfolding of narrative and understanding, and as well as the symbolic connections to the tripleus amexitoas, as a place where decisions are made and unmade. And so he says, so then we passed Armenia, we get the laugh, but we also get reference to all of this that he's brought up. And then as Tiresias continues down the road, then the next figure that we see is this woman, and she's scrubbing the steps of the palace, and David says, and we know this figure is named Mary, and the reason that we know this figure is named Mary, and then he goes through the syllogisms and all servants with red hair scrubbing palace and and we know that this figure is, and then somehow the syllogism ends with and it has to do, and I don't really follow all of what David is doing with this, but he seems to be combining several traditions together, including this early Christian tradition and a Greek tradition and perhaps British Isles tradition, Celtic mythology as well, and again, like not as versed and familiar with the connections between all of this and the way that David wants to perform the collaging of these symbolic values in these various traditions together. I kind of I'm unable to further read into, elaborate, and interpret this particular syllogism, but I do get that that she somehow belongs to both domains that that David is talking about: the unfolding of events in time, right? Tiresias walking toward the palace, and we know that we're getting closer because we get to the palace steps, and that she's washing them. And I don't get the Mary part entirely, but I do get, in a way, like the idea that maybe she belongs to three traditions, and that's another working of this idea of three, and she's the central figure in like what I'm anticipating already here. When I first watched David or listened to David perform this discourse, that there'll be another female figure towards the end. So then. He goes on and he says, in the third figure that unrolls, in the backdrop, and it's and this three-dimensional space, right? That's a kind of platform, upon which we see these figures is Jocasta, and he says, and we haven't, and the way that we know it's Jocasta is different from the way that we knew it was Diarmenia, which is through our memory, right? Because we'd already seen Diarmenia before, and the way that we know that it's Mary, and we know that we know that this character is named Mary, and that she's a servant. We know that she's a servant because she's washing the steps of the palace, and who other than a servant or a slave would wash the steps of the palace, he says. And we know she has red hair because you can see that she has red hair, and so that's observational, he says. And then and we know that her name is Mary because we know that all slaves who have red hair are named Mary. And he says, we also know some things that we don't know. We don't know which Mary she happens to be, he says. All right, so that's the way that we know that. And then he says, and the way that we know that it's Jocasta, is entirely different. It's the same. It's through the same means, David says, that we know, or roughly the same means, David says. He corrects himself. That we know that Laius is Laius. It's because she's wearing a crown, and we know that we're already at the palace, and who inside the palace of Laius is and the scene has changed, right, a little bit. Like, so we were outside before, and now the backdrop is telling us that we're inside the palace. So the backdrop is telling us we're inside the palace. We see this woman wearing a crown, and we know that she's got to be queen, and we know that we're in this context in which we're describing, an environment in which, the king is Laius and the queen is Jocasta, and he performs the syllogism. So it's the same kind of logic, but with different domains, like belonging to our understanding of the premises, right? But he says, but that's part of the discourse too, because as we come closer to Laius, we come closer in our understanding, right, to how, if we recognize, how we're recognizing these characters as who they are, we understand that as we get closer to Laius, we're getting closer to an Aristotelian approach to understanding than we were when we began, right, with memory and interpreter and these, symbolic values that belong to the idea of three and the sacred feminine and the tripleus amoxitois and trivia, right? And then David says, right? Are you following what I'm saying? And he says, and this figuration, like that's looming in the background, or can be looming in the background, if we attend to the way that we're understanding the elements, of these backdrops, and these figures that we're passing, right? Get closer and closer to the way that that the syllogismos is presented in Aristotle. So as we get closer and closer to Laius, right? Like we're leaving behind, more and more elements of the divine feminine, and that's part of the discursive domain that belongs to what we described as rhetorical deception in Kathy Acker's presentation of her relationship to Herbert Marcuse, but what we can describe as a symbolic organization like of discursive elements, here as it's presented in Aristophanes, right? And he says, and we know we've arrived. And he says, and the passing of each one of these figures, of course, it's comical because they all give Tiresias a look, but he doesn't look back because he can't see, and we can correct David there and say because they can't see. But he says, each passage, right? When he passes Diarmenia and she gives him a look, and then correct him again. When she gives them a look, the audience laughs. And then when she passes, David says, Mary, and she looks up from her scrubbing and wipes the sweat off of her brow, beneath her red hair. We get a laugh, and then as he passes Jocasta, and then we can correct him again, as they pass Jocasta, and Jocasta rolls her eyes, we get another laugh. And then the background eventually stops, and it stops, and precisely where it stops, then the background, which hasn't connected up, right? Because it's this unfolding background, it hasn't connected up. And then David says, and which side did I put? He can't remember. He says, I can't remember whether I put Laius on the right side of the stage or the left side of the stage, and I can't remember whether. Now I can't remember. He says, I can't remember when I remember the unfolding of the stage. I can't remember whether Tiresias was passing from the left to the right or from the right to the left, and which side of the stage that I had placed Laius on, and which side I had placed Tiresias on. But in a way, it doesn't. He says it doesn't matter. Like whether you sign he says it's like if you sign a signature and you sign it forward or you sign it backwards. As long as in the end it looks like the signature, it doesn't matter which way you sign it. He says, right? And then he's like shrugs his shoulders. And so we're right on cue right there. He says, as long, he's like, think about it. Like, it doesn't matter what the process was, right? Whether you sign the signature, say you're forging someone's signature, or say that someone doesn't want to sign their name to some letter or some document, and say that for whatever reason, you're either instructed to do so or you take it upon yourself to do so, that you need to sign this. And he says, whether you sign it forward or whether you sign it backward, in the end, it doesn't matter, because when it's sent as a message, right? When it's sent as a message to a receiver, what they're going to look at is they're going to look at the signature as it exists in this static form, this unchanging form across time. They don't know, he says. They don't know whether it was signed backward or forward. Now, the backward and forward, may have, symbolic value in relationship to some discursive domain, or it may, serve as some kind of, means and technique, right? Either to imitate the signature from the perspective of, understanding the psychological structure of the subject who signs the signature, or removing that completely and signing the signature as arche, as material representation, right, of a two-dimensional design in two-dimensional space, and then in that case, the arche, the muse of arche, would be the guiding, right? Would be the guiding techne under which teleosis were either maintained or failed. So if you think about signing it forward as an act of imitating the subject, and signing it backwards as a relationship to these various muses, right? It changes the relationship that you have to either success or failure in relationship to the teleosis, to the completion of the project, to Laius, right? the idea. And so just like Elijah Wood as Tom, in that movie, he says, like, well, if you think of it as, I'm going to perform this exactly the way that, say you were thinking like about a Bartok piece. I'm going to perform this Bartok piece. Bartok never wrote a piece called a Sanket, David said. But say he did. Say instead of Tom's tutor, it was Bartok who wrote this piece. The Sanket, right? And Tom has two ways of articulating the perfection of his playing of this piece. He can think of it as a well-crafted urn, as an object, and he can play it backwards. But he doesn't have to literally play it backwards. He can play it forwards, as if he were playing it backwards, but playing it backwards as under this muse, arche, and thinking about the telaiasis as getting it right formally. Or he can think about, maybe he heard, a recording of Bartok, because, there are a lot of performances in which Bartok performed his own pieces, And there are performances, of Bartok, playing piano, and there are recordings, right? So Tom doesn't even have to exist in the same space-time with Bartok and Benny Goodwin, but maybe he heard one of these recordings where Bartok is playing piano and Benny Goodwin is playing clarinet, and he remembers the way that Bartok plays, his own pieces. And what if that's the model for your telaiasis or your teleiosis? He says, what if that's the model? Then the model, for the completion and the perfection and maybe it's a kind of bijective function, like that the notes should correspond in a kind of one-to-one manner with the way that they were initially played by Bartok. And maybe Tom wouldn't be playing, the same thing that he heard Bartok play, but he could make a translation of it, right? And maybe there are differences. Maybe there are micro differences, or maybe there are macro differences in the way that the interpretation of the telaiasis, one way or another, as either performed through the remembering of the way that the piece was performed by Bartok, if Bartok had written the Sanket, or perceiving the piece, as this formal, right, articulation of a symphonia, of an arrangement, right, that is a composition, and the way that compositions are performed, like through arche, right? So maybe there are differences in the way that the thinking about the telaiasis, as either a backward or a forward, or a remembering, or remembering of how, versus an understanding of compositional strategy, create, right? Create, the material event reality of the performance, and maybe there's a way, of reading those differences, just like there's a way of reading, the differences between, understanding the signature, written forward, as a representation of the psychological structure of the kind of person that would sign their name that way, versus writing it backwards as a representation of this graphic figure as it appears on the two-dimensional plane, right? In this kind of this kind of Cartesian plane, or Cartesian articulation, right, of the mathematics of the surface of the page, as a kind of canvas, but as a kind of mathematical representation, right, of what could be, what could be articulated as a mathematical expression, right, and the design itself. So he says, like, if you think about it that way, and you really wanted to do the signature exactly, correctly, you could practice by putting it on a grid. Maybe you could make horizontal and vertical lines, and you could map like every moment of the tracing of the signature backwards, onto this constructed grid, like the same way that you would produce or reproduce, a Picasso. Say you wanted to reproduce a Picasso a Guernica, or say you wanted to reproduce, Henri Rousseau, or a series of Henri Rousseaus, or a Marc Chagall, or whatever, from the period of early modernism. And you could do this, and if you wanted to do it with some degree of accuracy, you could create a grid, like exists on graph paper, and then you could articulate, every moment, within the various squares of this grid, individually and more specifically, then you might be able to conceive of holistically, the piece and reproduce it from the psychological point of view of the subject, writing it forward, right? And he says, so anyway, so all of that. But in the end, he says, to the untrained eye, someone looking at it, whether you had performed the task, under the muse of arche and used the grid and understood it, as a two-dimensional design on this Cartesian plane and maybe graphed it out, or whether you understood it as a relationship to the psychological subject and you tried to imagine yourself as Henri Rousseau, or you tried to imagine yourself as Pablo Picasso, or you tried to imagine yourself as Chagall, and then you repainted this picture. In the end, once you send this thing through the mail or put it in an art book, whether you're a forger or whoever you are, or however you, for whatever reason you perform this thing, he says the people are going to look at it and it's going to say, this is either a forgery or this is real, or this either is a good forgery or a bad forgery, right? So it doesn't really matter in that sense whether Tiresias, advanced from the left side of the stage, toward the right, or whether, Tiresias advanced from the right side of the stage toward the left, does it? And so, in any case, we still have, the same, symbolic values in relationship to the figures who appear, whether they're appearing. He says, maybe there could be like a rhetorical symbolic, that articulates, dimensions of political ideology in terms of a linear, series of coordinations, like this two-dimensional representation of a line, on the Cartesian plane, right? And on the left, right, this line, and it has no rise, it has no slope, right? It's a line parallel, to the x-axis, right? And this line that's parallel, to the x-axis, it points in one infinite dimension, left, and in one infinite dimension right, and if this is your model, of politics and social history, right, and progress, and all of its and he says, and it's a pretty poor model, right? Because how is this model going to account for all of the innovations in technology and relationships to technology that are possible in a real world scenario, and the way that real world scenarios collage, symbolic values and social values and contents and events, such as that are semi-predictable and semi-unpredictable, like plagues and their relationships to, human failure and ignorance. And how are you going to plot all of this on this line? Like it's no more. He says the idea of a linear representation, of social political values as a line parallel to the x-axis is no more realistic or reasonable a mathematical model than the same figure is a reasonable or mathematical model of narrative, right? Right, so that's clear. But so whether Tiresias is advancing, toward Laius, from the left or from the right, in a certain respect doesn't make much difference, and you could say, well, maybe it makes a difference in terms of the rhetoric that's established in relationship to this project, as it relates to the figure of Oedipus as tyrant. So is the tyrant, a figure that exists on the right, or is a tyrant a figure that exists on the left? And he says, and David says, well, see again, the problem with this mathematical model of this linearity and this representation of left and right is that you have tyrants on the left and you have tyrants on the right. and it's not clear sometimes, which tyrant is which. Like was Mao Zedong a tyrant because he was a communist, or was he a tyrant because he existed in this great era of tyranny and authoritarian dictatorship? And maybe the dictatorship and the communism, had nothing to do with one another. And maybe the reason that there's some confusion regarding the relationship, between tyranny and whether it exists as a phenomenon on the left or the right, or whether it's an independent phenomenon that can be abstracted, from the model of the left and the right, is because the linear model of left and right, as it exists as a two-dimensional, almost one-dimensional, really, he says, but as it exists as a two-dimensional figure, on the Cartesian plane, as a line right, parallel with the x-axis, it is rather ridiculous and useless, way, of articulating and understanding of political, economic, or even technological, right, reality in any significant way or form, right, and its triviality is trivial in a different way than he says, then Hecate is an example of trivia at the crossroads, right? Okay. So then he goes on. So whether Tiresias was advancing from the left or to the right, you could say, and even if you wanted to say that it was a representation, right, of a political dimension in all of this, it doesn't get you very far. So he says, so maybe that's why I don't remember it, because it doesn't have any specific semantic content that's relevant to our understanding, in the way that all of these other symbolic values do have semantic content that is relevant to our understanding of Tiresias. Tiresias, the journey of Tiresias as a metanarratological investigation of these discursive domains that in some ways represent more, right, than just the telling of a story, but represent the telling of the way that a story can be told under the terms of the mythos logos, and the history and unfolding of the Greek culture itself, and the movement as it's performed here and elsewhere from this idea of a place that belongs to the divine feminine, and then he references he references Aeschylus and the crimes of Orestes, here, and the punishment by the Furies, and the transformation, Apollo's transformation of the Furies into the Eumenides, and how this is another kind of appropriation of he says, even though the Furies are horrible and monstrous, it's still a form or variety, right, of the divine feminine, and of the divine feminine's rights of retribution, right, and although it doesn't represent justice, that it does represent it does represent a law that belongs to the idea of these sets of taboos, and who is responsible, right, in relationship to these laws, and the form, right, of that responsibility in relationship to these laws, as a modality, right, of not only this idea of cause and consequence, but of the way that it's figured as a positionality of sex and sexuality, and of the distribution of power, right, in social systems and social networks. And what he's getting at is that the transformation of the Furies into the Eumenides, and giving power, to justice, right, over revenge, here takes the form of a transference of power from matriarchal authority in a certain sense, or matriarchal responsibility, right, to this ruling and presiding, patriarchal inscription that is placed, upon justice itself, and it belonging, to Apollo, and it's done so under this argument, in which, and David goes on extensively here and talks about how Apollo's argument in the Asclepius is another, parapraxis, and I meant to say Aeschylus, right? And Apollo's argument in the Aeschylus is that Orestes has the right to kill, his mother, or or at least, more so. It isn't a violation of the sacred, because it's the father's seed, right? That is the determining force in the development of the child, and the mother is merely the vessel, right? So there's this misogynist argument, David argues, that informs the backdrop of the transference of power, and the terms of this transference of power are certainly more subtle in Sophocles' construction of the syllogismos, and the movement away from the symbolic values of the tripleus amoxitoius, but they're there nonetheless, right? And so he's making a comparison to the way that this is a subtle, right? The narrative itself, is a subtle discursive argument of the appropriations, and colonial. What would the colonial, version of patriarchy, be? But the transformation, right, of these values that initially belong to the divine feminine into forms of patriarchy that if one looks closely enough and listens closely enough to the text, one can find, but one has to really pay attention in a way that one doesn't really have to pay attention, in the Oresteia, right? It's fairly obvious, what's going on in the Oresteia. It's fairly obvious what's going on in the transformation of the Furies into the Eumenides. It's fairly obvious in Apollo's, argument, involving, the seed being semen, in Apollo's argument is the seed and everything that belongs to the content of the genetics and biology of a plant, if you planted a seed or a plant in a pot, and the woman is merely the pot or the vessel in which the seed gets planted, and David says, and that's all, the misogyny and the transference into the domain of the patriarchy is all pretty obvious in the Oresteia, in a way that it's not at all obvious, and extraordinarily subtle in what's going on in the relationship between, Sophocles telling, versus Aristophanes telling. But it's there, nonetheless. And so after all of those digressions or asides, David then, returns back to the representation of this scene. And you'll recall, so far, we've only gotten up to the point where Tiresias, reaches Laius, in sitting Laius, sitting there on his throne in the palace, and what I'll do at this point is I'll check and see how lengthy our discussion is so far. And whether we need to end here for the purposes that are that are available to us in getting this up onto YouTube, and limitations of our technology here in our space and time, and if we have if we can proceed on further into David's discussion into David's reading, elaboration, interpretation of this, the second act of the Smile of the Sphinx, and or whether we should end here and then and to read, elaborate, and interpret, David's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the conversation that Tiresias has, and the warning, that Tiresias provides, Laius, and Laius's, failure, to heed, and why, Laius, fails to heed that warning, and his failure, is explained in, scene 3, Act 1 of the Smile of the Sphinx. But whether we have time, to perform any, of the rest of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of this this scene 2, or whether we need to end here. So let me check the time.